sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe.
Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where we listen to some of the greatest stories ever written, adored by Ursula Le Guin, Neil Gaiman, Leonard Nimoy, Ray Bradbury, and Stephen King. Enjoy classic tales such as Are All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, Sources of the Nile, and many others. Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of the Avram Davidson universe. As always, super excited. A few bits of housekeeping. We have new audiobooks available on audio. We have new books available on Amazon. Join the fan club, write some nice reviews. If you think you'd be a good guest, reach out and let us know. We're always looking for volunteers. I'm especially interested in folks who know how to use KDP. I'm always looking for proofreaders. And one of the new ideas I've had is creating an Avram Davidson universe timeline. So if you know Avram Davidson inside and out and you want to brainstorm with me and create a timeline of the Avram Davidson universe, let me know. It's a fun project I'm thinking about working on. Today's guest is Bridget Kimsey. Sometimes you just find a really interesting Avram Davidson fan, and that's Bridget. She's a healer and author. She's a registered member of the Lenape tribe of Indians. And today we're going to be listening to Traveler from an Antique Land. It was originally published in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine in September of 1961. And with that, we bring you Bridget. Looking forward to this episode. Bridget, it's so nice to meet you in person.
Hi, how are you, Steph? Good to meet you as well.
So nice to talk to you last time on the phone, but to meet you in person, great.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm excited to have you today. And I guess the first question is, how did you first discover Avram Davidson?
Yeah, that's a really interesting story. So my grandfather was a science fiction writer and really into science fiction work, as well as, was a journalist and was in the war. But he had tons of books everywhere. So this was in Montana. And he had his winter home in Butte, Montana, and his summer home in the cabin on the woods in Kalispell. So in the cabin, there were all these science fiction books, and Avram's was one of those books. And honestly, it was the pictures and some of the wording, and it was a little advanced for an 8-9-year-old brain. But it was still, but there were phrases that were just like, oh, I get it. Like it was very visual, and I'm a very visual person. So that was how I was introduced. Mm-hmm.
And over the years, I mean, do you have a favorite story?
I was thinking about that because I remember when I lived in Mallorca, Spain, in the little town of Dea, which has a lot of artists and authors and thinkers. The books would sometimes appear in different people's libraries in their homes or private parties. So, and it was such an interesting name. I remember looking at the Phoenix, and that really was a pull. But until we met and got to talking, I hadn't thought of his work or really gotten into it. But what I've always loved historical fiction. That's always been a draw to me. And then science fiction was something that became more of a draw later on. The multi-levered layers of his work has been a pull. And I'm excited as we're getting to know each other to go further and to start to really read them. So it's been good. It's been exciting.
And what you've read so far, I mean, what about his particular style resonates with you?
Well, what I like about his work is that even just one story, if I read it today and then I read it 5 days from now or 5 years from now, I'm going to get something different. And I love that. I love that idea that it's not over. And there's so many parts of it. It has like a sing-song feel to it. It has the historical component of it. It has this idea about like bringing you into the space and then wondering, well, what was going on behind the scenes, and him giving a real nice, accurate, maybe not completely like that's what happened, but it could happen and you could believe into it. So it's exciting to go on these journeys and then to revisit it a different time and then get something completely different out of it, because it's so layered, and it has this pendulum swing that seems to happen. And the only other time I've had that excitement in reading a piece of work is with Shakespeare, which I studied very intently. And, depending on how it was read, who was reading, how listening, like perform, not perform, you got something different out of it. So I like that multi-layered is something I resonate. Mm-hmm.
And in terms of, I know you're a writer, and what are you, just so people can get to know you a little bit better, what are you focused on? What are you focused on these days?
Well, I'm focused on creation and reality. I do resonate with Avram's work, which I know is fiction, and mine is at this point nonfiction, but people read it and think, oh, it's fiction. I am interested in my background as a Lenape Indian and my father's family, and bringing that into modern science. And how does that work? How does it work as a hereditary shaman and also a scientist in modern science? How do those two things work together? And so I've taken that journalistic scientific method to go deeper into exploring creation, and right now in astrophysics, but I don't want to frighten people. It's a different take on looking at physics and where does the universe come from and how does it work? And I hope I do it justice by it's somewhere between, it's nonfiction and it's somewhere between humanity and science. And I have a memoir, which is my first one, and then 2 books that begin this journey into really looking at creation.
If someone wanted to seek out your work, what book would what's the first book you recommend that they read?
So I would recommend my memoir first, because I wrote it in part because of I have about a 26-year history in working in hospital settings in integrative health. Okay. And doctors would say to me, oh, the person's in a coma, go do your magic, please help us. And I was like, it's not magic, it's based in physics and I can prove it. And they'd be like, And it became an outlet to describe the process. Now, if someone is saying, I just want to get into black holes and understanding more about that, or, they could definitely start with the first one, which is A Shaman's Perspective, Origin of Our Universe. Okay. But I always say, if people are up for it, to get to know what I'm doing and hopefully see the efficacy in it and how I secure this information. I think, again, like with Avram, really doing that research before you go into exploring your own voice, the knowledge that you want to bring forth. So I hope people enjoy it, and they can find it on Amazon under my name or be in touch with me directly.
Great. I recommend one of the stories. I wish in some ways that I'd met you earlier, Or the Grasses Grow.
Oh, okay.
It's an amazing story that Avram wrote. I'll get you a copy, and it's actually it's on. There's a podcast that I did, so it's available for you to listen to or to read. So I definitely would recommend that.
Oh, okay.
But before I'd say we should just get into a traveler from an antique land, and then talk about the story. You ready?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Traveler from an Antique Land. I met a traveller from an antique land, who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Shelley, Ozymandias. It was in April 1822, on the 3rd day after his friend had sailed off into a lead-grey, oil-smooth sea only a few hours before the storm broke, that Tregareth, fearing the worst, made his way to Lord Griffin's villa to consult with him. Was not Griffin the nominal head of the English literati hereabouts? The time was past noon. Griffin had already had his cup of strong green tea, and was lunching on the invariable biscuit and soda water as he lay abed. He looked up when the tall figure entered, long black hair in disarray, striking his fist into palm. "Surely there is some news, Tregareth," Griffin said. "Are they safe? Have they been found?" Tregareth shook his head. "I have no news, my lord," he said, trying to mask his agitation with formality. "Every vessel putting into Leghorn has been questioned, but there has been no sign of the sea sprite, of Shadwell or Wilson or the ship's boy. I thought that you might have had a letter, or at least a note from their wives at the Villa Grande saying that they had arrived." "I have had nothing," Griffin cried. "Fulk Grant has heard no word either. He blames himself, poor fellow. It was to welcome me and get me settled that they sailed to Leghorn, he says." "Oh, God, Tregareth," Griffin moaned, covering his fat, pale face with a trembling hand. "They have been drowned. They have surely been drowned." Tregareth, looking away from him, turning his gaze out of the window to the hot, sandy plain, said sturdily, "It does not follow, my lord, not at all. I conceive of at least 2 other possibilities, no, 3. First, they may have been carried away off course, to Elba, perhaps, or even to Corsica or Sardinia. Second, assuming the vessel did come to harm, which heaven forbid, though she was cranky and frisky, there were so many other craft at sea that evening." Tregareth spoke more and more rapidly, his broad chest rising and falling as his agitation increased. "Surely it is not unreasonable that they have been taken aboard one of them, and are even now disembarking in some port. And third, I fear we must also consider the possibility that a piratical felucca may have ridden them down, pretending accident, don't you know, my lord, and that presently we shall receive some elegantly worded message, which in our blunter English speech spells ransom." Griffin had begun slowly to nod. Now his face had cleared somewhat. He reached for his silver flask, poured brandy into the tiny silver cup. "What must we do?" he asked. "You have been a sailor. In fact, if we are to believe your own account of it, wilder than any tale I dared to write, you have been a pirate too. Command me, Tregareth, eh?" He drained the cup, looking at the Cornishman with raised brows. Ignoring, in his concern, the implication, the other man said, "I thank you, my lord. I propose, then, in your name, with your consent, to obtain the governor's permission to have the Coast Guard scan the beaches. Perhaps some flotsam or wreckage will give hint of—" He did not finish the sentence. Griffin shuddered. "And also I will have couriers sent out on the road to Nice, inquiring of news, if any, of their having reached another port. In the event of their having been captured by brigands, we must await that intelligence." Griffin muttered something about, in that event, the British minister. Tregareth's grey eyes grew fierce and angry. "Let Shadwell's wife, my lord, let poor Amelia appeal to the minister and to diplomacy. Let me but hear of where they are constrained, give me a file of dragoons, or if not, just a brace of pistols and a stiletto. I have stormed the corsair's lair before." "Yes, yes," Griffin cried. He rose from bed, thrust feet into slippers, and with his queer, lame, gliding walk, came across the room. "And I shall go with you. This is no coward's heart which beats here." He laid his hand on his left breast. "I know it, my lord," the other said, touched. And, telling him that he must make haste, Griffin thrust a silken purse into Tregareth's hands, bade him Godspeed, and gloomily prepared to dress. The 2 ladies met the Cornishman with flushed cheeks, cheeks from which the colour soon fled, as he confessed that he brought them no news. Jane Wilson essayed a brave smile on her trembling lips, but Amelia Shadwell shrieked, pressed her palms to her head, and repeated Griffin's very words. "Oh, God, Tregareth, they have been drowned!" But Mrs. Wilson would not have it so. She knelt by the side of her hostess's cot in the hall of the Villa Grande, a whitewashed room on the upper story, not much larger than the 4 small whitewashed rooms which serve for bedchambers, and taking the distressed woman by the hand, began to comfort her. Wilson was an excellent sailor, she said. No harm could come to Shadwell while Wilson was aboard. The storm had lasted less than half an hour, surely not enough to injure such a stoutly built vessel as the Sea Sprite. Tregareth added his assurances to Jane's with an air of confidence he did not feel. By and by the cries gave way to moans. Amelia pressed a handkerchief to her lovely eyes and turned away her head. Tregareth would have lingered, but Jane drew him gently away. They descended the stairs together. The sea foamed and lapped almost at their feet. For a moment they were silent, looking out over the beautiful Gulf of Spezia to the terrace. To one side was the tiny fishing village of St. Ursula. To the other side, a degree nearer, the equally tiny town of Lorenzi. At length Jane spoke. "Poor, poor, dearest Amelia," she said. "She has been far from well. It is not only her body which is weak, you know, Tregareth. She has been sick in spirit, sick at heart. It is the loss of her dear children. To bid farewell to two such sweet babes in so brief a time. No, no, Tregareth, man knows naught of what woman feels. It is too much." And so she spoke, mantling her own concern for the missing. Even when her husband's name, it was only in connection with Amelia's illness. "Did you know, Tregareth, that scarcely more than a week ago, when she was in truth barely able to turn on her couch, that we missed her one night? Wilson found her down below, her slippers sodden and her hem drenched, and she seemed like one who walks in a dream. I have not dared to part from her for even a moment since. We had better go back, but no word of this." Amelia smiled at them as they returned, a sad and worn little smile. "I am ready to hear what you have to tell me now, with more composure," she said. And so Tregareth recounted to her what he thought she might safely hear. How Shadwell and Wilson came sailing the trim little Sea Sprite over the wine-dark sea to greet the poet Fulk Grant and his family. How Grant and Shadwell had fallen into one another's arms for joy. How they had settled the new arrivals in satisfactory quarters, and how, finally, it was decided that the Sea Sprite and the Liberator, Lord Griffin's vessel, would return together, with Tregareth captaining the latter, while Griffin stayed behind. "Oh, why did you not do so, Tregareth?" cried Amelia Shadwell. "With a skilled sea captain such as you to convey them." It was the fault of the harbour-master, Tregareth explained. At the last minute he had refused clearance to the Liberator on some petty point or other. And so Shadwell and Wilson, by now impatient to see their wives once more, had sailed off alone, with only Antonio, the ship's boy, for crew. Not for worlds would he have told her of his fears, of Wilson's being, for all his wife's pride, but a gentleman's sailor, of how awkwardly Shadwell handled the craft, of what others had said. "Crank as an eggshell, and too much sail for those 2 sticks of masts," remarked the master of a Yankee ship, spitting tobacco. "She looks like a bundle of chips going to the fire." And the Liberator's first man, a Genoa man, "They should have sailed at this hour of the morning, not the afternoon. They're standing in too close to shore, catch too much breeze. That gaff topsail is foolish in a boat with no deck and no real sailors aboard." There had been only a slight wind, but in the southwest were dirty rags of clouds. "Is smoke on the sea," said the mate, shaking his head. "A warning," as the fog closed around the trim little Sprite. The air was sultry, hot, and heavy and close. Tregareth had gone below to his cabin and fallen into a doze. He dreamed of Shadwell, his dark fair hair only touched with grey, ruffled by the breeze, the light of genius in his eye, the look of exultation on his face, a boy's face still for all he was approaching 30, a boy's fair skin and light freckles, and a boy's look of eagerness. The world had never gone stale for Archie Shadwell. Tregareth had thought, as he often did, of his own good fortune in being the friend of Shadwell and of Mrs. Shadwell, and somehow he found himself envying Wilson, who not only had a beautiful wife of his own, Tregareth's wife was dead, but the company of the beautiful Amelia Shadwell. And then he had fallen asleep. And then had come the gust of wind, the temporale, the Italians called it, and the squall broke. It thundered and lightened, and he rushed on deck to help make all trim. In 20 minutes the storm's fury was spent, but Jane Wilson was wrong in thinking that was too brief a time for deadly damage. 20 seconds could do for so light a boat as the Sea Sprite. Thus 3 days had passed, 3 days of ceaseless inquiry. From Griffin, Tregarth had gone directly to the governor, mentioned the name of Il Milord Griffin, doucely slid the purse across the desk. "A courier, as far as Nice, of course. And the coast guards to patrol the beaches all about? Certainly." The purse vanished. Orders were given, messengers scurried. Tregarth had left in a flurry of assurances and come straight to the Villa Grandi. He had intended to leave as quickly to pursue his own search, to flag, and flog too, if need be, the coast guards into vigilance, for who knew if any of Griffin's gold would trickle down to them? But Amelia would not hear of it. "Tregarth, do not leave us," she begged, and he, looking at her sweet face, could not refuse to tarry a little while. Jane summoned a servant to make fire for tea. Jane herself was busy pretending the matter was no more than that of, say, a diligence whose lead mule had delayed the schedule by casting a shoe. She bustled about with needles and thread. But Amelia would not play this game. "Oh, Jane, in heaven's name, be still," she pleaded. "I am looking for the beeswax to help thread my needles," Jane explained, hunting and peering. "I promised dear Shadwell to finish that embroidered shirt for him. Where can it be? Is that not strange? A great lump of unbleached beeswax." Amelia began to weep. "Shall he ever wear a shirt again? And this creature wants to kill me with her talk and her scurrying." But the next moment Tregarth himself was kneeling and holding her hand, and vowing that Shadwell would live to wear out 1,000 shirts, 10,000. She smiled, allowed her tiny white hand to become engulfed in his great brown one. But she gave a little cry of pain. "Why, what is this, Amelia?" he asked, astonished, opening her fingers and looking at the scarce-healed marks there. "I was sawing wood, kindling for the fire," she said in a small voice. Jane and Tregarth exclaimed against such foolishness. There were servants. Amelia pouted. "They care nothing for me," she said. "Look at that slut there. Do you suppose she cares about me?" The servant girl, perhaps sensing she was being mentioned, turned at that moment. She smiled. Not at all an ill-looking wench, Tregarth observed, almost abstractedly, though of course one could not even consider such coarse charms in the presence of lovely Amelia. The girl smiled. "The signore will soon return," she said. Amelia spat at her, cursed, called her Puda, struggled to rise. "Madam!" cried Tregarth, shocked. "She meant but to reassure you, dearest Amelia," said Jane as the girl scuttled away, frightened. "She did not mean to. She meant to scorn me. Does she think I am blind? Does everyone think I am blind? Do you, Jane?" But the hysteria passed almost as soon as it had come. "Tregarth, forgive me," she said. "I am not well. Such sickly fancies cloud my mind. Oh, I know that Shadwell must be living. So great a genius cannot die so young. No age ever had such a poet. Does not Griffin himself agree? Was he not proud to have the little ship named after his own poem? Oh, I little thought, the day he carved his initials in her mainmast, that she would give her so much grief. I have had such presentiments of evil, such a sense of oppression that I have not felt for years, not since poor Henrietta." Tregarth felt the little hairs rise on his neck. Never before had he heard the name of Shadwell's first wife mentioned in this house. It seemed, he scarcely knew why, it seemed dreadful to hear it now on Amelia's lips, on Amelia's smiling lips. "Do you believe she drowned herself?" she asked. He could only stammer. "There are those who say—" Amelia paused. "No one says—" began Jane. But the sick woman smiled and shook her head. "Everyone knows of Shadwell and me, how we eloped while he was still a married man," she said dreamily. "Everyone knows that only Henrietta's death set us both free to marry." Everyone knows of Shadwell and Clara Claiborne, she continued. First she bore Griffin's illegitimate child, then she bore Shadwell's. Everyone knows. Her accusing eyes met those of Jane, who stood by, her face showing her pain. But only you and I, Jane, know... And she seemed to fall into a reverie. Then she chuckled. So pleased were they to have this sign of her mind passing to anything which had power to please her, whatever it might be, that they beamed. Do you remember, Jane, your first night here? Were you listening? How Wilson said, "To think that my wife and I are privileged to be guests under a roof which shelters two such rare geniuses, Archie, the author of that exquisite poem Deucalion, and Amelia, the author of the great novel Königsmarck. Do you remember, Jane, what Shadwell said?" "I did not hear, dear Amelia. What did he say?" "He said, 'Königsmarck! Ha ha!'" For days Tregareth rode the shores, scanning the waves, the scent of the salt sea never out of his nostrils. Some few bits of flotsam from the sea sprite had come ashore, but this was not proof positive. However, he no longer had doubts. He drove himself unrelenting in his quest. Not only grief for his friend spurred him on now, but guilt as well. "You have travelled so far, Tregareth," Amelia had said to him. "You are yourself that traveller from an antique land who brought back word of Ozymandias. In the East, of which you are so much enamoured, and of which you have made me so much enamoured, do they have love there, as we know it, or only lust?" Tregareth had considered throwing back his head. After a moment he said, "In the East they have that which is stronger than either love or lust. In the East they have passion." She considered this. She nodded. "Yes," she had said, "for love may fade, and lust must ever repel. Passion. Do not think that our English blood is too thin and cold for passion, Tregareth." Now he asked himself again and again, spurring through the sand, was it covetousness to desire a man's wife for your own, if the man were dead? Would not Shadwell himself have laughed at such squeamishness? Would not Griffin? He almost did not see the coastguard until the man called out to him. When he did see and reined his horse, he still did not imagine. Then the man gestured, and Tregareth looked. And there, on the margin of the sea, he saw him. "There is no doubt of it being Shadwell, I suppose?" Griffin asked. Tregareth shook his head. "None. Shadwell's clothes and Shadwell's hair. In one pocket Shadwell's copy of Hesiod, and in another his copy of Blake." Griffin shuddered. He looked at a letter which he held in his hand. "From Amelia," he said. He began to read. "You have heard me tell that my grandmother, a Scotswoman, was reputed to have been fey, and to have visualized the prince's defeat at Culloden before it happened. I, too, at times have had presentiments of future misfortunes. I had them at the time of poor Henrietta's death. But never so strong as during this springtime did I feel the burden. The landscape and seascape I saw seemed not of this earth. My mind wandered so as if enchanted, and oft-times I was not sure, and still am not sure, if the things I saw and did were real, or were the products of an ensorcelled mind, musing on ancient wrongs, and all the time the waves murmuring, 'Doom, doom, doom.'" They were silent. "What shall be done with the body?" Griffin asked. "The nearest Protestant cemetery is in Rome." Tregareth said, "Shadwell, a Protestant? If ever there lived a man who was a pagan in whole heart, body, and soul. Besides, in this weather it is out of the question to convey the corpse to Rome." Distressed, almost petulant, Griffin flung out his fat hands. "But what shall we do?" he cried. "He was a pagan," said Tregareth, "and shall have a pagan funeral. The Greeks knew how, and I have seen it done in India." Griffin began to quiver. He reached for the silver flask. The widow received the tragic news with an agony of tears. Presently she recovered somewhat and said, I knew it would be so. I have had no other thought. Now he is young forever. Now," her voice trembled and fell, "mine forever." They parted with a gentle embrace, she accepting Tregareth's counsel not to attend the immediate funeral. Later, he said, when a second interment would be held at Rome, if she felt stronger. Tregareth's emotions as he rode back were mixed. In great measure his activity on Shadwell's behalf had absorbed the grief he would otherwise now be experiencing at Shadwell's death. Moreover, thoughts he had earlier suppressed rose now and had their will. Had there not been in Shadwell's friendship for him some measure of condescension? Had Shadwell not indicated from time to time, though less openly than Griffin, a lack of complete belief in the stories Tregareth told of his youth in Nelson's navy and his adventurous career as the consort of buccaneers in India? But, sharpest of all, Shadwell was dead, and he, Tregareth, was alive. It was dreadful about the former, but it was impossible not to feel gratitude and joy in the latter. As he rode between the forest and the sea, Tregareth felt the keenness of delight in the fact that he lived and could experience all the rich pleasures of the living world. The body had come ashore near a place called Via Vecchio. A small crowd had gathered, but the dragoons scarcely needed to hold them back. The people looked on, half fascinated, half horrified at the strange scene, and kept crossing themselves. Tregareth was in full, undisputed charge. "I might have spared myself the trouble of bringing wood," he said. "See, not only is the forest there full of fallen timber, but here are all these broken spars and planks cast up upon the shore." He gave directions in loud and resonant tones. The workmen dared not resist, though they looked as if they would have mightily liked to. A pyre was soon built up, and the body lifted onto it. Tregareth heaped on more wood. One piece he glanced at, put it under his arm. Griffin was pale and ill at ease, but gentle little Fulk Grant did not even trust himself to stand, and remained sitting in the carriage. "I think all is ready," Tregareth said. He cleared his throat. Hats came off in the crowd. "Surely Shadwell's shade is watching us," he said, "as we prepare to bid farewell to his clay. Behold the verdant islands floating on the azure sea he loved so much, and which he took to his final embrace. Behold the ruined castles of the antiquity, whose praises he sang in incomparable numbers, for the numbers came. Behold the snowy bosoms of the ever-lofty mountain peaks. All these Shadwell loved. Shadwell! Varley!" He poured over the body a quantity of wine and oil, then took the waiting torch and thrust it under the pyre. The wood was tinder dry and flared up directly. "Varley Shadwell!" Tregareth cried again. He cast into the fire the copy of Blake which had been in the drowned poet's pocket. He tossed on a handful of salt, and the yellow flames glistened and quivered as they licked it up. "Behold!" he exclaimed, "how peacefully the once raging sea is now embracing the land as if in humility, as if to crave pardon. O Shadwell, thou—" But here Griffin interrupted him. "Tregareth, cease this mockery of our pride and vain glory," he said in a stifled, low voice. Tregareth, his long black hair floating on the wind in magnificent disorder, looked at him with some surprise. Then he looked over to Fulk Grant. But little Grant, still in the carriage, now had the silver flask in his hand. The only sound he made was a hiccup. Tregareth shrugged. He tossed in a handful of frankincense. The flame mounted higher. The heat grew more intense. "I cannot endure to remain much longer in Italy," Griffin said. "Every valley, every brook will cry aloud his name to me. We must go off somewhere together, Tregareth, you and I. For now I have no one left. America, Greece, somewhere far off." He sobbed aloud, then turned and walked away. The fire crackled and hissed. Tregareth stood all alone by the pyre. Slowly he took from under his arm the piece of driftwood. It seemed a portion of a ship's mast. On it were carved the initials G.G. He clearly called to mind that happy day, only a short while back, when Gerald, Lord Griffin, had carved the letters. The top of the piece was all rent raggedly, but on the lower part the breach was only partly so. The rest of it... He could envision the scene. The sudden trumpets of the storm, the terribly sudden blast of wind, the foremast crashing down before the frightful pressure of the wind-caught sails, mast and sail falling as dead weight upon the gunwales, and the ship careening and filling, and then going over, going down, as the sea rushed in, and the lightning served only to make the blackness deeper. Tregareth ran his fingers over the smoother surface of the wood. Someone, plainly, had sawn half through the mast, and then hidden the cut with unbleached beeswax of the same colour. He lifted his fingers, bent his head. Despite the wash of the sea and the scouring of the sand, Tregareth could still note the scent of the wax. He thought, for just a moment, that he could even detect the scent of the soft bosom in which the wax must have rested to soften it. But this was only fancy, he knew. It need not, however, remain only fancy. Love, he reflected, can fade, and lust must ever repel, but passion is stronger than either. He came as close to the pyre as he could, threw in the shattered section of the mast, and watched it burn fiercely. Then he turned and went to join the others. Afterward, to Traveller from an Antique Land. Davidson was not the first to treat the history of English literature as the setting for crime fiction. Lillian de la Torre's stories of Sam, Johnson, Detector, are probably the earliest sustained series. The suggestion Davidson makes about the death of Shelley is novel. The letter from Davidson to his agent, Robert Mills, printed here, identifies the actors in this thinly veiled account of the death of Shelley at sea in 1822. Perhaps the most accurate portrait is that of the unsavoury Trelawney, Tregareth, who is notorious as the designer of Shelley's sailboat and the man who found Byron a doctor in his final illness. Few men have had the distinction of causing the deaths of two poets of such stature. Trelawney dined out on his fame for the rest of his long life. Henry Wessels.
Postscript to Traveller from an Antique Land. A letter from Avram Davidson to Robert Mills, 3rd of October, 1960. October 3rd, 1960, 410 West 110th Street, New York City, 25. Dear Bob, thank you for sending along Fred Danny's very interesting comments on Traveller from an Antique Land. I think I see exactly what he means. Some of the changes he suggests have been already made. Others I shall make. For instance, forget actual names of towns I call Sant Ursula and Lorenzi, if other volume was really Sophocles. So change to Hesiod. The cities of Nice and Rome are, of course, both fictitious. The letter from Mary/Amelia is from an original. I should have liked to essay another in the same vein, but I eliminate as directed. Fred does not mention my having pointed out that much of the funeral oration is in Trelawney's, and to a much lesser extent, Leigh Hunt's own words. I guess he simply forgot, and, as I am sure he does not want it to stand so, I have paraphrased. I am sure I do not know what he means about asking me not to play any tricks or try to fool him. The ox knoweth his stall, and the ass his master's crib. On second thought, I will try to compose another Mary/Amelia letter. If not desired, it may be eliminated, so that this part of page 12 would then read simply, Griffin shuddered. They were silent. The date I supply, as directed on page 1, is the actual one. If this is not what was wanted, it may safely be changed to, say, 5 years before or after. I trust these revisions will do the trick. I did not feel up to retyping the whole MS a third time. Yours, Avram Davidson.
What'd you think?
Oh man, that plot twist. Oh, wow. There's so many like layers. Again, like what I was talking about, those layers, and the visual imagery. And I find the short story form just so hard to do well. And when it's done well, it looks effortless, like a ballet dancer. It just looks brilliant. And I can feel the crafting and hear the, read the crafting happening, but it's not like glaringly obvious. I was not expecting the end, nor the historical reference. It was wonderful to be drawn in, to not be hit over the head like this is what's happening. Hence I'm wearing, like, I thought of it like I'm wearing the wine dark red sea, I love that. I love that. Like, that's one of my favorite. He says that in that part when they're journeying in the dark red wine sea. I just think that was awesome.
I mean, for me, the character of he calls him Tregareth,
Yes.
but is actually Trelawney. I
Right.
mean, from a historical perspective, Trelawney seems like wow, this is someone that I need to learn more about. I mean, I want to find out as much about this guy. What an interesting person. And certainly, as I always do with Avram's work, I went way askew from the story and started researching Trelawney because he is fascinating.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, I was not expecting the ending at all. That was a plot twist.
Anything else that made the story particularly special to you? I mean, if you had to just, a minute or so, just kind of what made the story so special?
It's like, I don't want to say it's effortless because I know it takes effort to know what to take out and what to keep in. But I think even in such a small number of pages, I get a fullness of the character, how they look, how they feel, what they're thinking, how they might even hold their body. It's just how it's so, yeah, it makes me, it makes me want to like read it or listen to it again. Like because I feel like it gets something different again, as I said, each time. And just the strong visualization, drawing in and just sort of going along. When you're reading and you kind of forget that you're reading, like you're just sort of there in it. That's what it does for me.
Yeah, a lot, and I haven't looked, but a lot of people say you'd be surprised how little Avram actually says, or how so much of it is your own imagination, and you don't even realize.
Yes. Isn't that amazing? Like the
happens.
wine, like what is it? I go back to the wine red sea. The wine, the dark red, where I had it written down, the wine dark sea, like that. Wow. I mean, because if someone's had red wine, they know how it feels in their body. They know how it feels in their brain. So imagine looking out at that sea and sail, the people are like saying, don't go, because they know that when the sea looks that color, has that feel to it, not a good time in Italy usually to sail. And so that simple few words just brought up for many people, and having lived on the Mediterranean, it brings up very clearly what's happening, what's going to happen. Very short.
So as I always like to do, I think I love to imagine big, and I mean, I think this would be an amazing movie or series.
Yeah.
But I always like to pull out one character, and I am just completely fascinated with Trelawney. It's actually Edward John Trelawney. Again, they call him Tregareth.
I'm gonna now have to look that up, Seth.
Yeah. So I recommend everyone look up Edward John Trelawney. He's a fantastic person. When I initially looked up Trelawney, one of the problems that I had was Professor Trelawney from Harry Potter kept appearing page after page. And so I finally had to start listing other poets and Trelawney to find that it's Edward John Trelawney.
Wow. Good digging.
Yeah, so he's an incredibly interesting character. His picture is fascinating. But if you were to make a movie about who would play Trelawney
All right. I had a few ideas here. I went, well, see, I remember there's this movie, or it was like sequence of movies, you know how they do on Netflix or HBO now, called The Undoing with Hugh Grant. I don't know if you saw that. And so Hugh Grant, we think of as this one character, but he turns out to be, not to be a spoiler, this very villainous, like deeply twist, like something's not right, but he gets, like, he's very charming, he gets away with things, he knows how to work the system. So I thought, like, Hugh Grant is too old now maybe to play the character, but a younger Hugh, or would it be someone like Keanu Reeves? Would it be someone who has this sort of, and then even as we're talking, I thought of the character from The Witcher. I forget what the actor's name is. He's from England or Wales or something. I thought he was a really interesting, you know, that's a hard, who do you think? Those are the names.
So for me, and I use him a lot because I think he's such an amazing actor, and I've been a fan of his since he was in Empire of the Sun as a little boy, but Christian Bale.
Yes.
You know,
yes, that's it.
I thought he could definitely pull it off.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, thinking of him in like The Machinist, or in, I think it was Batman, you know, like he can play such, so even just because there seems to be so many levels and layers to this character in Avram's work, that's why I was struggling. I was like, well, he kind of looks like Keanu, but maybe he has that twistedness of Hugh Grant's character not doing, but then he has the charm of the Witcher guy. So like, who could, but yeah, Christian Bale. That's great.
But you know, but I can't thank you enough. It's so much fun. It's so nice to find you in person.
Yes.
Is there anything else before we go? Is there anything else about Avram that sort of jumped out at you, that just anything else you'd want to share? Final thoughts.
Oh gosh, I don't know. I hope it's, I mean, I had mentioned, I think that from what we've discussed and reading about him a bit more, because I'm level 1 autistic or Asperger's, I really wondered, I think that people who have neurodiversity, and I wonder, they just have this incredible ability to hold multiple things at once, so to be forward thinking, to be in the moment, to bring you in, to take you further. And I do see that characteristics of some really amazing autistic writers in his work, which gives him that edge of being able to do these multi-level dances that we don't see in a lot of neurotypical people. So I don't know. That's neither here nor there.
I think it's fascinating.
I think he has a special brain and a special way to write. And I hope that readers can start with a piece of work that is really user-friendly, and then go further. Because it's like with Shakespeare or some of these other great authors through time, they have such depth that it can be a little off-put, like, oh, the language, I'm not quite sure, but give it some time, or listen, or read, or take it in pieces, or read it with a friend. It'll be worth it.
I saw, I remember seeing this one review of Phoenix in the Mirror.
Yeah.
Young gal, I'm sure she's very nice. And she said, I didn't get it. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, you got to have a little patience. You maybe start with something a little simpler, work your way up. Because the first time I read Phoenix in the Mirror, I had no clue what was going on.
Right.
I love Phoenix in the Mirror now.
Yeah.
So you need to work. It's like working a muscle. You got to work up to it.
Absolutely. And someone can take their time with it. You know, you could read, also reading with a friend, or just taking a few sentences. It's thick work, and it's well nourishing, I think, for the soul and the brain. But you know,
I think Shakespeare is a great example from a high school perspective. If you just handed a high school student and said, hey, read this with no experience, and they just read Shakespeare, like, I can't even get through the first paragraph.
Right.
But when you have an opportunity to interpret it and see what's really going on, you go,
yes, it's phenomenal. It's I mean, one can go on and on, but I think that what we're looking at with Avram is something that stands the test of time, and that can be a companion as one ages, so that something pulled that to me when I was a child. Now, I couldn't quite understand, but I could see little phrases in it, kind of like, was like, oh, that's really cool. Oh, that is true. I like that. What is that? And now that I'm older and I have more literature experience, I can really appreciate and sort of not always have to get it in one shot and then go back. So I think he has something for where anyone is. And I think that celebrating, because I still think of him as a modern author, compared to like the 1500s or something, but I think that I think also having the way that people's brains work and how we view the world is really important to incorporate, and not just go with the typical science fiction or typical, and that's sort of what I struggle with my work is like, no, it isn't your typical physics exploration, and it's not a new age book. It's somewhere, it's a history lesson, and it's an opening to our future. So I think that happens with his work too, for sure.
Bridget, I cannot thank you enough.
Oh, thanks, Seth. Always nice to talk.
Yeah, let's stay in touch. Maybe do it again in the future. And
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Be well, everyone. Take care.
God only knows. It sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable.